You are listening to We Saw the Devil, an investigative and conversational true crime podcast that deep dives into fascinating criminal cases that are solved, unsolved, or ongoing. From America's Lori Vallow to Germany's Armin Meiwes, we examine and discuss the world's most shocking cases. If you're enjoying the show, don't forget to follow us online. Check us out at WeSawTheDevil.com and We Saw the Devil on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And don't forget, you can become part of the show by backing us on Patreon. Hello everyone, you are listening to We Saw the Devil. This is Robin, and to intro today's episode, I have a really bad joke for you. Two cannibals are eating Amy Schumer. One says to the other, "Does this taste funny to you?" The other says no. And much like Amy Schumer as a whole, guys, cannibalism is not really a laughing matter. But we will talk about this momentarily. Before we get into all of this, I know it's been a while. Thank you for your patience. Took a couple weeks off, changed my job, changed my life a little bit. Yeah, I just haven't had the bandwidth to actually consistently, once again, put out episodes. That being said, consistency is now finally back in session. Super excited about that. So for those of you who may be new or just stumbled across this podcast, you can find us at WeSawTheDevil.com. You can find us across all social media at We Saw the Devil, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, everything. You can listen to us on Stitcher Radio, Spotify, Google Podcasts, even Audible, apparently, and Amazon Podcasts. And as always, don't forget to check out our Patreon. If you're interested in getting like cool stuff, cool shit, postcards, episodes of the month, the ability to help choose show topics, even come on the show. Check out our Patreon at patreon.com/We Saw the Devil, where you can financially back the show for as little as $3 a month. So let's talk about like one of my favorite subjects, guys. I love cannibals. If you recall, feel free to check out a previous episode where I covered the German cannibal Armin Meiwes, who put out an ad online back in the early days of forums and was looking for a consensual victim, a man who wanted to be consumed and consume him, well, at least pieces of him, he did. I think the practice of cannibalism, especially as it pertains to true crime, arrived on most of our radars when we were very young grasshoppers and learned about the Jeffrey Dahmer case. Speaking solely for myself, that's how I came to understand it. And I have a fun little fact/story and side note with that. I learned about cannibalism because of my mother. When I was really little, she was a teacher at a small podunk-ass college in rural Tennessee, way before we moved to Nashville. We moved to Nashville when I was 6 years old. One of her students, I didn't even remember her, I was too little, but one of her students ended up going on to nursing school and becoming a traveling nurse. And she would frequently check in with my mom. Whenever she was back in town or coming to visit her family here in Tennessee, she would always stop by, either see my mom, go out to lunch, something. Now, I remember being 12 or 13 years old, and this student came to visit us one day as she was traveling through Nashville. And this was in the mid-90s. This woman's name was June. And June, if you somehow are listening to this, I don't have your contact information anymore, but please reach out. I would love to talk to you again, especially about this, but just in general. That particular day, my parents made dinner. June stopped by with my mom to check in, visit, and talk. I'm sitting there quietly eating my ribeye steak, bored out of my freaking mind, from all the adult talk and whatnot about work. And June was a traveling nurse, you see, and she had just gotten off on assignment at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. Now, I heard my mom say something to the effect of, "I don't even know how you stood being near him. The thought just gives me chills, sends the shivers down my spine." I believe that was the direct quote, but I barely recall. I was barely listening, completely tuned out, and then my mom's reaction pulled me into the conversation. Interest piqued. Consider me interested. I asked my mom who she was referring to, and she said, "Jeffrey Dahmer." I was like, "Who's that?" And June told me that he was a cannibal who had murdered men and eaten them. She was a nurse at the prison and was even there the day that he was beaten to death and was one of the first people there. Like, I obviously just peppered her with questions until my parents became sufficiently annoyed, and then I went upstairs. I spent the 10 minutes that it took logging into AOL, beep, 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 and then tried to read up on shitty GeoCities websites about who this insane man named Jeffrey Dahmer was and precisely what he had done. And my mind was blown. I just could not fathom how that took place. And if you guys recall the internet back in like the 1990s, it was real bad. GeoCities, just really shitty websites. Every freak of nature in the world was on there, and it was like our first glimpse, like truly into other freaks of nature. So a lot of people like thirst trapping after Jeffrey Dahmer, and I was just like, it was like whole new world. It was just weird. But my mind was blown, and that was probably honestly my big introduction to the world of true crime anyway, and how utterly heinous it could be. And since then, I do typically keep up with a lot of the cannibal killer cases in the news. This podcast, myself, like I've covered Tamara Samsonova, the granny ripper out of Russia. Horrible human being. Listen to that case. I want to re-record it. It was one of the first episodes, if not the first that I did on this podcast. But she basically killed as a retirement option. She's old, had no money, no benefits, like the equivalent of Social Security. So she's like, I'll just, kill someone, eat them. And if I get caught, hey, going to jail, 3 hots in a cot there. So I'm good. And then Armin Meiwes, whom I've already discussed. I find cannibalism as a whole to be fascinating, as it is utterly revolting to the senses. So for this episode, and it's actually going to be a 2 or 3-parter, probably a 2-parter, I'm going to discuss cannibalism as it pertains to pop culture, true crime, and history. But first, let's just go ahead and get the etymology out of the way. And a quick history lesson. The word cannibal comes from the Spanish name Cannibales, given to the Carib. Apologies if that is incorrect. The Carib, a tribe of American Indians who lived during the time of the Spanish conquest in the Lesser Antilles and parts of the South American coast. Now, this is like circa 1550s. If you're trying to make a modern day connection, like to descendants, Dominica, St. Vincent, Belize, and Guyana. So as the Spanish conquistadors encountered these people and learned more about them, they came to understand how war-centric they were. They would raid other local islands, loot their resources and women, and even bring back human body parts as trophies. Have you seen the horror movie directed by Eli Roth called Green Inferno? That's legit what I think of. It's a very Western colonial view for me to have. Because there's actually, guys, very little evidence that this particular tribe of people went beyond war trophies, as body parts, and ate their victims. There's very little evidence to support that. When you think of cannibals, it's likely you envision the image of a tribe, again, of brown or darker skin, boiling or roasting human flesh for dinner. And that caricature of actual cannibal practices is a really old myth perpetrated largely, inadvertently, by more modern explorers and conquerors. Colonizers sucked, basically. But the Spanish were behind in the game because cannibalism has actually been in literature and pop culture since basically the dawn of time. And it continues to permeate pop culture in nearly every single aspect. According to Merriam-Webster, the first known use of the word cannibal was in 1553. It kind of started way back. In Greek mythology, Tantalus served the Olympian gods the flesh of his son, Pelops. In William Shakespeare's late 16th century play Titus Andronicus, the character Tamora is unknowingly served a pie made from the remains of her 2 sons. And then in my all-time favorite, guys, in Fanny Flagg's novel, Fried Green Tomatoes at the Whistle Stop Cafe, investigators are unknowingly fed the barbecued ribs of a man whose murder they are investigating. Love the movie if you haven't, Tawanda. The musical parody The Rocky Horror Picture Show, which is a cult classic, has a scene in which Dr. Frankenfurter kills the character Eddie and then serves his flesh to dinner guests. The Drew Barrymore-led Santa Clarita Diet on Netflix portrays a sweet suburban housewife who's a mother, and she just happens to develop a taste for flesh after coming back from the dead. And then we have my favorite, the French film Raw. It's a heinously gory, feminist, coming-of-age story about a young veterinary college student who discovers, despite the fact that she's a vegetarian, that she has a craving for raw meat. All hell breaks loose. The metaphorical applications of this film are just absolutely endless, and I cannot recommend it enough. There is a slightly, I believe, edited version on Netflix, but if you want the full experience and want to know why people were like vomiting in the movie theaters and left and got all like their feathers ruffled, rent it. It is an amazing film. I've discussed like the new French Extremity, which is basically French films from like the year 2000 and forward that just take things a little far, whether it's with the gore, the themes, whatever. Martyrs is one. I've done 2 episodes on that. Great film, but it's just so brilliantly done. Rent it. But point being, out of all of this, is there's no shortage of media on this topic. There's a reason why every true crime podcast in freaking existence is still covering cases like Jeffrey Dahmer, Armin Mivas, the Donner Party, the Uruguayan Flight 571. It's why Silence of the Lambs became a cult classic and spawned the television show Hannibal. And just this week, I started the show Yellow Jackets, which fucking amazing. If you haven't, watch Yellow Jackets on Showtime. Like, I wish Showtime would pay me because I would pimp them out every chance I get. But I started Yellow Jackets this week, and it's basically a gender-swapped Lord of the Flies about a girls' champion soccer team, their plane crashes in the Canadian wilderness, and looks like they may or may not be resorting to cannibalism in order to survive. But I mean, we're all fascinated by cannibals, right? It's taboo. It's disgusting. It takes something that most of us get pleasure from, food, and juxtaposes it with a horrifically violent and gory act. I mean, our reaction to cannibalism is categorical disgust. But the fact remains that cannibalism, whether in the animal kingdom itself or when referring to humans, is more common than you actually think. It's actually observed in more than 1,400 species. Up until the late 1980s, biologists believed that certain scenarios caused animals to turn to cannibalism: lack of access to food, mating, stress. At that point, it had only been observed in just like a few, like 5 or 6, maybe a couple more different species. That was it. But as scientific advancements were made, it became very clear that it actually wasn't all that strange. Hippopotamus, the cane toad, sharks, salamanders, dogs, wolves, polar bears, and even, I'm so sorry to break it to you, this broke my heart as well, the sloth. I mean, the list is endless. And this is partially due to the increased focus on global warming and climate change. One biologist claims that 1/10 of a degree change in seawater temperature correlates to a 10% increase in the odds of cannibalism. But what about humans? Do the same things drive us to devour our own kind? And the answer, in the hundreds of hours of research that I've done throughout my lifetime and also for this episode, the answer appears to be pretty complicated. There are entire research teams whose sole focus is the study of prehistoric cannibalism. And the research has all overwhelmingly agreed on one particular thing. Our ancestors, my ancestor, your ancestor, they were cannibals. Going all the way back through the Bronze Age, Ice Age, Iron Age, and beyond, evidence has been produced showing that cannibalism was an option at the proverbial table. Specifically in the Bronze Age, where a substantial amount of archaeological evidence has shown cut marks, teeth marks, and even chopping using very rudimentary tools. These were especially prevalent on longer bones like the legs and the arms, which shows an attempt to get to that sweet, sweet, sweet bone marrow. I mean, can you blame them? Due to these studies, researchers have widely agreed upon multiple subcategories for the act of cannibalism. And we're going to go through, this is why this is going to be a multi-episode multi-episode. Good Lord, I can't talk today. Multi-episode series, guys, is because there's like actually a lot of different types of cannibalism, and true crime focuses on one. So we're going to go over quite a few of these because there are really interesting and insane stories from all of them, like all the subcategories. The first is nutritional cannibalism. And this is where basically you eat because of you need nutrition. A side note, according to research conducted by James Cole at the University of Brighton, boars and beavers pack about 1,800 calories into each pound of muscle. But modern humans, like you and I walking around, guys, we only pack in about 650 calories into each pound of our muscle. So sad to say it, but we actually aren't that nutritious. Just in case any of you had any ideas, humans are not that nutritious. Then there's symbolic cannibalism. Think Christian mass, eating the wafer that symbolized Jesus's flesh, the grape juice that's supposed to be his blood. It's just purely symbolic. Then we have survival cannibalism. Think Donner Party, the 1972 Andes plane crash, like from Uruguay. Or even more recently, guys, North Korea. One defected military officer who fled North Korea with his family into China, said that he witnessed the mass famines in North Korea. And he said, quote, "People are going insane with hunger. They even kill and eat their own infants. This kind of thing is happening in many places." And many movies have been made about survival cannibalism. Then we have autocannibalism, and this is the act of eating oneself. If you're also up for another interesting movie recommendation, check out the movie Eat, where a struggling 20-something-year-old actress suffers from this condition. It's really gross too, by the way. But however, it isn't usually that extreme. So asking all of the listeners, have you ever eaten any of the following? Scabs, your nails, have you ever chewed a nail and swallowed it? Your skin, your hair, ever picked your nose and eaten a booger in your life? If so, congratulations, you are officially an actual cannibal. I joke because some forms of them can be so extreme that it actually becomes a diagnosable mental illness. But like, there are people who have the uncontrollable urge to remove one's own body part, like eyes, fingers, toes, even carving out chunks of your own flesh just to cook and eat them. So if you just chew your nails or, pick a scab here and there, like no judgment here. It's when you have an uncontrollable urge to do it and eat it that it's not good. Then we have Epicurean cannibalism. This is for people who like it because of the sensory experience they have while eating it. They think it tastes good. They're like, well, this is just like a nice beef tenderloin or filet mignon or a nice bone-in ribeye. I love the texture and the taste of it. Then we have ritual cannibalism. And this is actually the very most common form of cannibalistic practice found in the world. And it actually couldn't be further from any of the other forms that I've previously mentioned. An example would be a newly deceased relative. Some cultures dissolve their ashes into a drink. Their blood could be added to a drink or a dish. Ritual cannibalism occurs only under certain circumstances and for a very, very, very specific purpose. Sometimes, in some cultures, it's actually even considered a moral or social obligation. It can be done to worship gods. It can be done, there's a form of mortuary cannibalism, of strictly dealing with the dead. Ritualistic cannibalism also covers like war, celebrating war, eating people, bringing back, those trophies. Puberty rites if you hit adulthood, fertility rites. Anthropologists usually focus on ritual cannibalism and use the subcategories of exocannibalism, and that refers to the consumption of members from an outside group, like outside of their culture. And then endocannibalism, which refers to the consumption of members of one's own group. And finally, we have what most likely you're interested in. We have the Bundys, the Dahmers, the Armin Meiwes of the world, pathological cannibalism. And the $1 million question, guys, why the fuck do they do it? That's why we're into true crime, right? What drives people to commit heinous and senseless acts of violence, mayhem, and murder? Why? Just like, why? What causes them to do it? Psychologically, what happened there? And I think a lot of people are specifically interested in cannibalism, like yours truly, because of the taboo nature of it. I mean, I honestly cannot wrap my mind around how someone can be sitting in a restaurant one day, see another human being and think, holy shit, they look delicious. But people far more intelligent than me, and with a much higher pay grade, have been attempting to figure this out for many decades, in fact. And here's one of the latest and most widely accepted case studies of this. Now, the full study has been posted to the Journal of Forensic Science, and the full article is there if you want to pay for it and read it. It's actually super, super interesting. A group of researchers in France chose 5 cannibalistic patients. They were all male, all aged 18 to 36, who were hospitalized in a secure unit in a remote city in France. And they found that just right off the bat, there were 2 groups. The first is those suffering from severe schizophrenia. And the second was those suffering from a mixed personality disorder with sadistic and psychopathic features associated with extreme paraphilia. Okay, so pause. If you somehow missed the episode on paraphilias that I did a while ago, a paraphilia is defined as an abnormal sexual practice. Paraphilia is a term created by psychoanalyst Willem Steckel in the 1920s and consists of the Latin root para, which means above or beyond, and philia, which means love. So quite literally, paraphilia means love that is above or beyond the norm. I mean, it's the literal definition. But I have some more questions for you. Do you like rough sex? Maybe you liked getting choked a little bit, having your hair pulled, watching others have sex. Do you like it when your partner talks dirty to you or calls you names or belittles you during sex? All of those things can be kinky and healthy additions to a couple's sex life. However, in order for a paraphilia to be diagnosed per the DSM-5, the interest must be to the point of psychological dependence. It must either cause the individual significant distress or cause harm to a non-consenting party. So again, before anyone gets huffy, standard kink between 2 consenting adults, 2 thumbs up, get it done. Sex acts that cause individual distress, are harmful physically, emotionally, mentally, or are non-consensual, major thumbs down and could be illegal. Absolutely not. Now, I'm sure I'll get messages about, merely mentioning the DSM. And yes, I acknowledge the problems with it. There is potentially a very vast influence by the pharmaceutical industry on the revision process of each version of this manual, and it does tend to medicalize patterns of human behavior and also mood that aren't actually all that extreme. And keep in mind, it was just in 1973 when the American Psychiatric Association issued a resolution saying that homosexuality wasn't a diagnosable mental illness or sickness. And since then, the APA has been very vocal and very strongly opposed to conversion therapy or any other means of reparative therapies for the purpose of converting the LGBTQ community. But I digress. Back to that case study from France. Again, 5 male cannibalistic patients, all 18 to 36 years old, and they fell into those 2 subgroups. First, severe schizophrenia, and second, mixed personality disorder with sadistic and psychopathic features associated with extreme paraphilia. 3 of the patients fell into the schizophrenia group, and cannibalism was deemed to be a self-defense reaction to a perceived threat. The cannibalistic acts done by those patients were done impulsively and spontaneously. They were not planned. They thought that they were in a life or death situation, survived the danger, and ate their victim's flesh raw. They did not enjoy it, and again, severe schizophrenia was considered the root cause. For the remaining 2, that was the schizophrenia group had 3 cannibalistic patients. The mixed personality disorder group, ego and narcissism were the central driving factors. These 2 cannibalistic patients that fell into this group had long-term cannibalistic fantasies going back to their childhood years. When they attacked their victims, they both did the same thing. They prepared, i.e., they cooked the meat, and they also reported having done this at very low depressed and unstable times in their life. They reportedly had very low self-esteem and very, very low sense of self-worth. And the researchers found one thing that connected all 5 patients: their childhoods. It had one of 3 items: dysfunctional childhood with sexual abuse, severe violence at home, or 3, extreme emotional neglect. Now, more research has been done on this as well. Feel free to spend the time and go to cánnibalismresearch.org. Marlies Usland and Michael Brecht from Humboldt University of Berlin and Princeton University, respectively, generated a super interesting data set of 121 cannibals. 121 cannibals they analyzed. And this data set digs deep. It includes the most well-known ones like Dahmer, Chikatilo, Sagawi, but also more obscure and lesser-known ones. It also includes data on 631 victims. Also, the preferred methods used to kill them, how and where the cannibal killed, how they bound their victims. It's actually very interesting and highly worth the time spent browsing, because homicidal cannibalism is actually such a rare thing. There hasn't been a considerable amount of research done on it. It's so rare, in fact, that of the estimated 2,000 active serial killers in the United States right now, operating today, only between 5 and 10 are probably cannibals. At least that's what Dr. Eric Hickey, professor of forensic psychology at Walden University, says. And here's another interesting piece that I found too while researching this. Back in 2016, a student by the name of Kayla Rice of Eastern Illinois did her master's thesis on behavioral patterns of cannibals. And in this survey, she and her graduate team at the Department of Clinical Psychology enlisted the help of Amazon. Yep, Amazon. Amazon has a sector called Mechanical Turk, which it advertises as a sort of like 24/7 workforce. You can pay people to take surveys, do user testing, small little tasks like that. Well, Kayla and her team decided to shit in more than 100 people's Cheerios one day and have them fill out a cannibalism choice questionnaire for a whopping payment of 10 cents. And their hypotheses were very simple. They believed that after, for filling out the survey, that the participants, especially men, would be significantly less likely to be disgusted to have sex with and then cannibalize a young person. They believed that participants, especially men, would be significantly less likely to be disgusted to have sex with and then cannibalize someone with a higher level of attractiveness. So basically going to places, sex and attraction, and how those two pieces intersect with cannibalism. Would you cannibalize Kate Moss or someone that's hot over grandma, or an 80-year-old unattractive woman, or a 24-year-old unattractive girl? They basically gave the two ends of the spectrum: attractive or ugly old person, or attractive or ugly young person. They wanted to know that if people would choose to cannibalize the same type of person that they typically choose to be intimate with. And what they discovered was interesting. The participants' desired sexual partners did not actually predict preferences for their cannibalism victim at all. In fact, the results were super, super mixed. It did, however, show a preference for attractiveness and youth in both taboo types. So basically, participants are generally pretty cool with eating who they want to fuck, but not always. It was very 50-50. And that is you can find the whole thesis statement if you actually look up Kayla Rice, Eastern Illinois University. It's called Behavioral Patterns of Cannibals. And it's super interesting. She lists out all the questions, all the data sets and everything. Very, very, very fascinating stuff though. But can you imagine just like being on Amazon, like and for a while there, apparently it's still a thing. You can do a survey, make like 5-10 cents or whatever. And that being the survey is, would you rather have sex with a young person and eat them or an old person? I bet those people did not expect that when they woke up and logged onto their computers that day. But anyway, The French study is currently, as it stands right now in 2022, the most popular and well-known study of this, and it established a few personality traits that many cannibals seem to share. They are alone, they had really bad childhoods, whether through neglect, sexual abuse, or violence, and they feel alone. A lot of them either cannibalize due to the anger and resentment of being alone, or they want to find someone, in Jeffrey Dahmer's case, and make them a lifelong companion. And we're going to go into a lot of those. We're actually going to go in the next episode. I'm stopping here, guys, as kind of like the, prequel to this the series. We're going to go through some personality types, Dahmer, Armin Meiwes, other well-known cannibals, and we're also going to discuss survival cannibalism, like what happened on Flight 571. Why are people still so obsessed with the Donner Party and what likely happened? We're going to cover a lot of those coming up on future episodes, but wanted to get kind of like the baseline, the history, the different types of cannibalism, and we're going to continue covering like research and big pieces as well. But I wanted to at least get the intro out of the way. Whew, I love cannibals. So fascinating. Anyway, guys, that is it for this episode. Again, you're listening to We Saw the Devil. You can find us at WeSawTheDevil.com across all social media. And if you're digging the show, please feel free to reach out, support it on Patreon. You can find us at patreon.com/We Saw the Devil. Until next crime.